You know, we keep wondering if is there going to be anybody else? That question still is not answered.
The whole tennis world reacted within hours. Nadal posted publicly. Sinner stood in front of cameras in Madrid and said, "Tennis is a much better sport when he's around."
You know, there are great players around, and
Roland Garros called it heartbreaking, and every single fan watching from every corner of this planet felt the same thing drop in their chest. Because Carlos Alcaraz, the youngest career Grand Slam champion in history, had just pulled out of the French Open. Wrist injury, April 14th, Barcelona, one match, done. But here is why this video exists. Because what the world reacted to and what tennis experts are now exposing are two completely different stories. The wrist is the story everyone covered. The self-doubt is the story nobody touched. And the experts watching his every match, every press conference, every body language breakdown, they are seeing something alarming. Something that has been quietly becoming his worst enemy long before the wrist ever gave way in Barcelona. This channel covers what the mainstream won't. If you are not subscribed yet, do it now. Because what comes next will permanently change how you see him. To understand exactly what these experts are exposing, and why the self-doubt goes so much deeper than any injury, we have to go back to March 2025, Miami, a press conference, and 3 words that made the entire sport go silent. March 22, 2025, Hard Rock Stadium, Miami. The press conference room was quiet in the way that rooms only go quiet when someone important says something nobody expected. Carlos Alcaraz, 4-time Grand Slam champion, former world number 1, the player an entire sport had anointed as the future, had just lost to David Goffin. Not lost a Grand Slam final, not lost to the world number 2, lost to the 55th ranked Belgian in straight sets, 5-7, 6-4, 6-3 in the first round of the Miami Open. And when a reporter asked him how he was feeling, he did not reach for the usual deflections. He did not talk about opponent quality or bad days. He leaned into the microphone and said it plainly. "Mentally, I'm screwed, honestly. This is a tournament where I want to do well, and losing in the first round hurts a lot." 3 words, a room full of journalists, and a silence that traveled around the world before the press conference even ended. That is where the experts started paying a different kind of attention, not the casual attention of match previews and rankings updates. The deep attention, the kind that tracks patterns, revisits old footage, pulls apart post-match press conferences word by word. Because what Alcaraz said in Miami was not an isolated moment of frustration. It was the loudest data point in a sequence that had been building for months. He had arrived in Miami on the back of a quarterfinal exit at the Australian Open, a quarterfinal loss in Qatar, and a semifinal defeat at Indian Wells to Jack Draper, a player he should have been comfortably handling. 1 title from 4 tournaments. That was the return from the man the sport had been calling the most complete player alive. Now, to be precise about what the tennis experts were actually exposing, and this matters because the self-doubt narrative has a habit of getting stretched beyond what the evidence genuinely supports. What they identified was something specific. Not a collapse, not a crisis of confidence across every surface or every situation. What they saw was a player who carried a mental fragility in defined contexts and who had no reliable mechanism to stop it from spreading into others when the pressure stacked high enough. Justine Henin, the former world number 1 and 7-time Grand Slam champion, had been watching Alcaraz closely throughout 2025, and she did not soften her words when she spoke to Eurosport. "I think he has doubts when he plays indoors," she said. "He's not confident enough. In theory, he would have the potential to play excellent tennis there too, but he has to overcome the mental obstacle that is limiting him." The indoor record backs her up. Before his breakthrough Rotterdam title in February 2025, the first indoor title of his career, Alcaraz had a 31-14 win rate on indoor hard courts across his entire career. That is a 68.9% conversion rate. Against his overall career win rate of more than 81%, the gap is jarring. On every other surface, on outdoor courts, in Grand Slams, in Masters 1000 finals, Alcaraz performs at a level that makes the rest of the tour look like it is playing a different sport, Get him inside a covered arena under artificial lighting, and something in the mechanism shifts. Henin had watched it happen enough times to put a name on it. She called it a mental obstacle. She meant it literally. But the indoor numbers, as revealing as they are, were not what made the tennis experts genuinely alarmed. Everybody has surface preferences. Everybody has conditions they handle less comfortably than others. What turned a statistical curiosity into a genuine concern was something Alcaraz had been doing in public for years without the full weight of it being understood. He had been telling people exactly what was going wrong inside his head, not in therapy sessions, not in private conversations, in front of cameras, into microphones, in interviews published internationally. He had been confessing the self-doubt out loud, and the world had been filing those confessions under the category of refreshing honesty without stopping to ask whether the honesty was also a symptom. He told Gazzetta dello Sport that he had been working with sports psychologist Isabel Balaguer since 2019. Balaguer is not a wellness consultant. She is a professor and the director of the Sports Psychology Research Unit at the University of Valencia, one of the foremost researchers in the field in Europe. Alcaraz told the Italian newspaper directly, "Sometimes I get negative thoughts, but she helps me manage them. She gave me advice on how to deal with match stress, and things have improved a lot." He said it matter-of-factly, which is part of what made it so striking. This was not a player who had gone through a rough patch and decided to try something new. This was a player who had needed structured psychological support since he was 16 years old, who credited that support for being able to function at the level he functions at, and who said without hesitation that without it, the negative thoughts would be unmanageable. That single interview should have been the headline that changed how everyone analyzed his career. Instead, it was largely reported as a feel-good story about mental health awareness in sport. The experts heard something different in it. They heard a player describing a psychological dependency, a genuine, ongoing need for external regulation of internal states that most elite athletes manage without specialist intervention. And they started asking a harder question. What happens when that support is not enough? What happens when the negative thoughts arrive faster than the management techniques can contain them? What happens, in other words, in Miami? The answer, it turned out, was exactly what everyone saw. "How am I feeling? Dreadful," Alcaraz told the ATP Tour's press corps. That was his opening word, dreadful. Not disappointed, not frustrated, dreadful. A word that carries weight in a different register than the standard post-match vocabulary. He went on, "I started playing worse from the beginning, making mistakes until he broke my serve. A breakdown in the third set made me feel very bad." The physical description and the emotional description were inseparable. His legs felt tired. His confidence disappeared. His level dropped. In his own telling, it was impossible to identify where the physical problem ended and the mental one began, because they were not two separate problems. They were one problem wearing two faces. Alcaraz confirmed afterward, when speaking to Spanish media, that Miami was the last time he cried over tennis. That detail is not a footnote, it is the clearest window into exactly how deep the self-doubt was cutting at that moment. A 21-year-old who had already won 4 Grand Slam titles, who had already been world number 1, who was already one of the most decorated players of his generation, sitting in a press conference room in Florida, trying not to break down, after losing a first-round match to a man ranked 55th in the world. The portrait that the experts were exposing was not of a weak player. It was of a player carrying a burden that the trophies had never been heavy enough to lift. And then something happened that made the whole story considerably harder to tell simply. 3 weeks after Miami, Alcaraz won Monte Carlo. 1 week after that, he won Rome. And then he walked into Roland Garros as defending champion, reached the final against Jannik Sinner, and found himself in the 4th set, down 2 sets to love, serving at 0-40 with Sinner, holding 3 consecutive championship points. The moment the self-doubt narrative was supposed to arrive at its most devastating destination. The moment where every pattern the experts had identified was supposed to crystallize into its logical conclusion. He saved all 3 match points from 0-40. He broke Sinner's serve in the following game. He won the tiebreak. He won the 5th set 10-2 in the super tiebreak. He became a 2-time Roland Garros champion in a match that lasted 5 hours and 29 minutes. the longest men's final in French Open history. After the trophy presentation, Alcaraz stood at the microphone and said, "I just believe all the time. I have never doubted myself, even on those match points down. It is a Grand Slam final. It is no time to be tired. It is no time to give up. The real champions are made in those situations when you deal with that pressure." This is the contradiction the experts are actually exposing. Not a simple story of a player destroyed by self-doubt. A far more disturbing story of a player who carries genuine, documented, professionally managed psychological fragility, and who is simultaneously capable of saving 3 match points from 0-40 in a Grand Slam final against the world number 1. The two things are both true at exactly the same time, and that combination is not comforting. It is genuinely unsettling, because it means the self-doubt is not being defeated. It is being managed. And management is not the same thing as resolution. By November 2025, Alcaraz was telling Spanish media something that seemed, on the surface, like encouraging news. He said he was talking to Isabel Balaguer less frequently. "I'm talking less and less with her," he said. "Thank God, since Miami, I haven't had that feeling of needing to vent because everything has gone really well." The tennis media reported this as growth. The experts heard a different reading. A player who had needed weekly psychological support was now describing good mental health as the absence of crisis rather than the presence of genuine stability. He was not talking to Balaguer less because he had solved the underlying pattern. He was talking to her less because the season had gone well enough that the pattern had not been forced to surface. That is an important distinction, and it is one that the mainstream coverage consistently missed. Then came December 2025. And an earthquake. Alcaraz announced the end of his 7-year partnership with Juan Carlos Ferrero, the man who had built him from a 15-year-old club player in Villena into the greatest junior prospect his country had ever produced. The man Alcaraz had publicly called a second father, the man who had been present for all 6 of his major titles, all 24 of his tour-level titles, and every meaningful moment of his professional life, gone, in a social media statement. 3 weeks after, they had all sat together in Turin at the ATP Finals and planned to continue working together in 2026. Ferrero did not hide how he felt. "Right now, I'm hurting," he told the Spanish newspaper Marca. "These kinds of relationships are difficult to end overnight. I gave it my all. I poured my heart and soul into this project." He said the decision had not been made by Alcaraz himself. It had come from Alcaraz's team. A distinction that actually made things more complicated, not less, because it meant Alcaraz had watched the person he described as a second father be removed from his life by the people around him and had not or could not stop it. The psychology of that moment is not something that processes cleanly in a few weeks. Tony Nadal, who spent his career coaching his nephew Rafael through the psychological demands of elite tennis, offered a perspective on what the split really revealed. He said that in professional tennis, the player who pays generally expects to hear what he wants to hear, and that the coaches who tell the truth, the ones who push back, who say the uncomfortable things, who prioritize long-term excellence over short-term harmony, are the ones most likely to be removed precisely because they are doing their jobs correctly. Applied to Ferrero, the implication carried weight. This was a coach who had won the ATP Coach of the Year award twice while working with Alcaraz. He had not failed. He had been let go anyway. Whatever the internal dynamics that produced that outcome, the result was that Alcaraz entered 2026 without the one person in his professional life who had been his psychological anchor for 7 years. He went to the Australian Open and won it. He became the youngest man in history to complete the career Grand Slam at 22 years and 8 months old. He beat Djokovic in the final in 4 sets and stood on court afterward saying it was a dream come true. The world celebrated. The experts watched the footage carefully, because what Alcaraz said at the Australian Open was revealing in a way that went beyond the achievement. "A lot of people were talking about everything and having doubts about my level in this tournament," he told reporters. "Coming this year, I was hungry for more, ambitious and strong mentally enough to not hear anything or any words from the people." He was describing a version of himself that had specifically chosen not to listen to external noise, deliberately shutting out the conversation around him. That is not the language of a player who has overcome self-doubt. That is the language of a player who has learned to quarantine it temporarily. Those are not the same thing. And then came Monte Carlo 2026, April 12th. Alcaraz had been defending champion. He arrived having led Sinner in the head-to-head 10-6, having won 3 of their 4 previous meetings on clay, having beaten Sinner in both the Rome and Roland Garros finals in 2025. He broke serve first in the opening set. He held what looked like control. And then the match tilted, the tiebreak went Sinner's way, and Alcaraz unraveled. 45 unforced errors by the end. Not because of wind alone, not because of bad luck. After the match, Alcaraz sat in his press conference and gave a self-assessment that would have been completely unremarkable, except that it rhymed so precisely with what he had said in Miami 14 months earlier. The important moments, the important points, I didn't play well. I had so many opportunities in the match that I didn't take, so many games, so many 15-30, love to 30. He was describing, again, a pattern of self-doubt becoming his worst enemy when the match reached its decisive junctures, performing brilliantly until the moment the match demanded something beyond performance, and then contracting. 3 weeks after Monte Carlo, he was in Barcelona. First round, first set, 1 return shot, his wrist gave way, and the next 4 tournaments disappeared from his calendar in succession. Barcelona, Madrid, Rome, and Roland Garros. The 2-time defending champion at Roland Garros was watching the draw build on television from home. Now, here is where the experts land, and their conclusion is more complicated than the title of this video suggests. And deliberately so, because the most sophisticated analysis of what is happening with Alcaraz does not conclude that the self-doubt is destroying him. It concludes something more troubling. It concludes that the self-doubt is becoming a permanent feature of his architecture rather than a temporary obstacle on his way to dominance. Henin said it in March 2026 when asked about his Miami exit that year. A year ago, we asked ourselves what was going on with Carlos Alcaraz. I do not think we will repeat that mistake. She then added the line that matters. Enjoyment and motivation are crucial for him. Over the course of a career, these are the things that determine a legacy, including the ability to regroup and refocus. She was not saying he was broken. She was saying his relationship with the psychological demands of elite tennis is the central question of his career, and that nobody, not him, not his team, not the experts, has answered it yet. The wrist injury that pulled him out of Roland Garros 2026 is real. The physical recovery is a legitimate process. But when he comes back, whether at Wimbledon or later, the conditions that produced Miami and Monte Carlo will still be waiting. The self-doubt does not take time off during injury layoffs. It accumulates, it compounds, it sits quietly inside the mechanism until the next high-stakes moment arrives and asks the question again. The tennis experts are not exposing a player who is finished. They are exposing something the scoreboard cannot show. They are exposing a player whose worst enemy has never been across the net. It has been sitting in the press conference room, answering questions after the loss. It has been in the Gazeta interview, talking about negative thoughts. It has been in the Barcelona locker room after a wrist scan came back worse than expected. Carlos Alcaraz is 22 years old. He is the youngest career Grand Slam champion in history. He has 7 major titles and more records than his age should allow. And he is in a fight with himself that trophies alone have never been enough to win. That is the story the experts are exposing. Not a collapse, a battle. An ongoing, unresolved, deeply human battle between a player who is capable of saving 3 match points in a Grand Slam final and the voice inside his own head that has been telling him since he was a teenager in Murcia that the next loss might be the one that proves he was never as good as everyone thought. If this video gave you a perspective you have not seen anywhere else, and this channel exists specifically to find those angles, then share it with one person who follows tennis seriously. Drop your take in the comments. Tell us whether you think Alcaraz beats this or whether the self-doubt keeps finding him in the moments that matter most. Subscribe if you have not already, because this channel covers the conversation that happens behind the headlines, and there is a great deal more of it coming as the season moves toward Wimbledon. The Alcaraz story is nowhere near finished, and neither is this one.